It was the dawn of the third age of podcasting, 30 years after the series had launched.
The Babylon Podcast was a dream given form. Its goal, to discuss the place where humans and aliens could work out their differences peacefully.
It's a port of call, home away from home for established fans, newbies, John, Blaine, and guests.
Humans and aliens wrapped in 2,500,000 tons of spinning metal, all alone in the night.
It can be a dangerous place.
Wait, what?
But it's our last, best hope for peace.
This is the story of the last of the Babylon stations.
The year is 2024.
The name of the podcast is
Babylon 5, 30 years later. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Babylon 5, 30 years later, the podcast where we usually look back at episodes of Babylon 5, 30 years after their original broadcast. We being myself, Blaine Dowler, and my podcasting partner, John Wilson. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing pretty well. This entire podcast will be covered by or conducted via email. So I'm just typing up all of my responses to your responses as you say them, and we'll just put them in the text.
Yes. Okay. And looking ahead, John, we may have a bit of a problem today, but I consider it a happy problem.
What's the happy problem?
We might have more feedback than we can fit into one episode.
Oh, you mean they wrote a lot of letters?
Yeah.
Goodness gracious.
Yes. So we've already added one extra feedback episode in this period because we weren't sure we can get it in. Partly because with the end of Skype, just pulling the curtain back a little bit, John and I are now recording on StreamYard, which has a 2-hour limit on free accounts.
You remember 2 years ago when Skype ended? Yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah.
Actually, no, this is feedback. This is current. Never mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is like a little over a month ago. So yeah, we explored other options. We tried an alternative that we used for our recording of Into the Fire. So that one, we didn't stick with it. It had some automatic editing tools that I think cut off some words a little too abruptly, removing the uhs and ums. StreamYard works well. Again, though, free accounts have the 2-hour limit. The not free accounts are not super cheap for a couple of teachers. So, you know how we have all those email addresses for this show, and we've both had lots of podcasts in the past? Yeah, they have a StreamYard account each. Anyway, so we do have a 2-hour limit, and we could very easily have more feedback than 2 hours. So this podcasting break in the show might have 3 feedback episodes by the time it's all said and done. We'll just have to see how it all plays out.
We'll play it by ear, mail.
Yes. So because of that, now it is time to dig in. Our first piece of feedback. Do you want to read the first one, or should I?
Sure. We've got Mahatma Randy, frequent writer to the show, wrote in on May 31st talking about episode 9 of season 2 called The Coming of Shadows. He saith, in defense of Michael O'Hare's performance of Sinclair, I've known a lot of career military officers who are actually like him. He does act like a senior officer, endless sleepless nights, always overloaded with work, personal life suffers, added to which he's crippled by survivor's guilt, he's unconsciously suicidal, he's probably got PTSD, even though this is never addressed. The problem with his performance is that he's a little bit too realistic. He once said that his brother was lieutenant colonel in the army or something, and a lot of Sinclair came from him, and also his stage performance of A Few Good Men. But what's realistic doesn't necessarily play well on TV. So pause on that. I don't remember exactly what we said about O'Hare in that episode. I do know that over the course of the first season, I had a varying degree of reaction to him that shifted over the course of the season. I kind of warmed up to him as we went along, but at first I wasn't really that keen. Sheridan's portrayal is just very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it we talked about how Sheridan he brings more visible energy to the role. But I've heard from a lot of people that Sinclair, and actually the closest equivalent on Star Trek is Sisko. Those two leaders seem to be very close to what actual military leaders are like today.
Mm-hmm. In his statement that what's realistic doesn't necessarily play well on TV, I think that's true for storytelling in general. I used to use this happens in reality defense of odd storytelling choices a lot. And, over time I began to realize, okay, that can be a good defense from time to time. But when it comes to storytelling, you want to take that feeling of what happens in reality and turn it into something that has emotional resonance. And that's not always the same way of portraying events. So, generally speaking, super realistic is not necessarily super good storytelling.
Yeah.
Mahatma Randy goes on to say, I do think his performance is a little bit too dour, and I think that was a choice on JMS's part. He went a little too Captain Pike, emphasizing guilt and the weariness of command, whereas Box-Leitner went a bit more Captain Kirk. Damn, my job is fun. I love this. Which in both cases was both an understandable mistake and an entirely appropriate course correction. I'm going to go with the Captain Pike reference from The Cage primarily, because I think that's where that guilt and weariness is really brought out. Less so in Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, and knowing Mahatma Randy outside of this podcast, I don't think he's terribly familiar with Strange New Worlds. So
everyone should watch Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, I'd say it's the best of the live action streaming era. I love Prodigy, but anyway, that's another podcast, and we have plenty more feedback. But yeah, I think that's a fair assessment where we did see that shift between the two original Star Trek pilots from, the world-weary captain to the young and excited captain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we had a similar parallel here. And I think some of that was just, when they were building Captain Sheridan, they wanted him to be different and not just the clone. So it didn't feel like they were effectively recasting with a new name. And JMS also recognized people are going to have certain expectations of Bruce Box-Leitner because of what he's played in the past. So particularly Scarecrow and Mrs. King was the last time he was a TV lead. Plus, I think people coming to Babylon 5 are more inclined to be familiar with Tron. So
there's a new Tron movie coming out later this year, which is going to give me an excuse to sit down with the wife and finally watch Tron.
Oh, good.
Since I've never seen it.
Oh, okay. Good to know. You should do that in July, and then maybe we'll record a bonus episode for the movie with Bruce Box-Leitner and Peter Jurasik and David Warner. Anyway, you can think about that. We'll cut that out if you don't think that's going to happen.
Record an episode with them?
No, record an episode about Tron as bonus in the middle of this big break we're in.
Okay. You said with those guys. I was just confused about your meaning there.
Yeah, meaning that the movie had all three of those Babylon 5 stars.
Yeah.
Fair. All right. Our next piece of feedback is an email from Ryan Wilson about The Coming of Shadows and Gropos that we got on June 2nd. He says, hello, Babylon 5 people and John Suntress. Obviously, this is one of the major episodes of the series. The three of you went into plenty of detail about it. It's obviously one of my favorite episodes of the series, and for good reason. I like how Morden is just mentioned, but we don't see him. I figure some of this is budgetary, but I take it to mean that he's always around and up to something, even if we don't physically see him. It's almost like he's in the shadows.
I think he goes a lot in Morden's limited performances up to this point, that he's already a character we can refer to without actually seeing, and viewers are going to know who he is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does say quite a bit about the impact he's made, because I think at this point we've seen him twice. We saw him twice in season 1. I don't remember if we've seen him in season 2 yet, but not that many. He's one of those guys when you check him on the IMDb and see how many episodes he was physically in, people go, really? Just that many?
Right.
Anyway, Ryan continues, I honestly think this is one of the worst things that Londo has done so far. He knows he's wrong, but he goes ahead anyway. He's not so far gone that he doesn't feel bad about it. Obviously, the most heartbreaking scenes are G'Kar realizing the Emperor was going to apologize. He hadn't thought that would ever happen. It changes his perspective, and he tries to reach out to Londo just as the attack on the Narn colony has already happened. Peter Jurasik's acting when Londo and G'Kar are getting the drink shows just how big a mistake this was and that he knows what he's done.
deer lights in the rearview mirror kind of look that he has.
Yeah. This war obviously is against the purpose of the station. There's no going back now. Andreas Katsoulis gives an amazing performance as usual. Rifa is interesting to me since he shows a similar viewpoint but completely unencumbered by Londo's guilt or fear. He's just a fanatic and more dangerous. It's what Londo could become if things keep going. It's a small part, but I really like it as a character, and I think the actor William Forward does a great job. Yeah, I would agree. They actually decided Rifa's full name is Forward Rifa to honor the actor because they were so happy with him. Ryan continues, Sinclair's small appearance is obviously great to see. I'm not 100% sure Garibaldi can just arrest someone for following him, but never mind.
I think Garibaldi can arrest somebody for whatever reason he wants to. How long he can actually hold them is whenever the rules come into play.
Yeah. At least the Emperor got to see a Vorlon. I didn't think it was much comfort, though. Okay. Now, Gropos suffers from coming after the coming of shadows, but that's not really its fault. I think the episode does a good job of showing different military officers in different scenarios. I don't think we ever get a full breakdown of the conflict, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. Father-son stuff with Franklin and his father is well done. Both actors do a great job. Good thing the defense grid is being improved. Gee, why would that be a good thing? The fact that everyone we meet is killed in action is, well, it's par for the course of the show. On to the next episodes.
Well, I don't know if it's par for the course of the show yet. You know, there's hints of future bad stuff happening that could lead to more bad stuff happening. But I think at this point, the Gropos ending is pretty stark for what we've seen up to this point.
Yeah, it not so stark that it's, wow, this show went there, right? It's not so far of what the show has done to be really out of place, but it's, you know, if you were watching this for the first time coming in from a Star Trek history, I think that would be a lot more shocking because right, Star Trek has very different expectations. And, you know, the darkest Star Trek is generally not this dark, especially not at the time this aired.
Right. Because they just did a montage shot of dead bodies at the end there.
Yeah.
And our friends were just left standing in silent mourning. That's a pretty dramatic way to end a show. It is.
So I think it's probably about the darkest Babylon 5 had gotten to this point, but it's just a small step darker. So it's not out of line.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that takes us to our next piece of feedback, which is from Ryan Wilson again. Hi, cousin. So he's writing about the next two episodes, All Alone in the Night and Acts of Sacrifice, episodes 11 and 12. He says, hello, Babylon 5 crew. Ryan, we don't actually work on Babylon 5. We're just podcasters. I don't know if that was like obvious or if we miscommunicated that, but yeah, just to let you know. He says, All Alone in the Night is a fun episode. I like that friendship Sheridan sets up with Talon. Plus, we get some odd dreams and birds. I'm having trouble remembering the details on this one. I do know this is where he has the dream that like comes back up later. Was it Talon? Is that how he pronounced that person's name?
Yeah, I think so, or Talon. But this is the one where he was abducted and forced to fight other aliens.
Oh, that's right. It has the person that he tries to work together with and doesn't exactly have success, right?
Yeah, so this is that Narn who, at the end of this episode, feels like a one-off. And he's not.
We also see the impact of Delen's decision to go through the chrysalis as she is removed from the Grey Council. That can't possibly have any portents for the future. Giving her space to Naroon is a good dramatic choice. Oh, Naroon. There's a Bug Bunny cartoon. It's like, oh, what a Naroon. What a Nincow poop. We get some great cautiisms too, of course. I like that he makes a point to tell Sheridan, he's always been here. Once he gets back to the station. Then he leaves. Bruce Boxleitner's confusion makes me laugh. Sometimes Kosh's obscurity in how he speaks feeds the mystery, and sometimes just like, what the heck are you saying? What are you doing? I feel like we've gotten more of the former as we've gone on, but I remember some times whenever Kosh was just like, why are you talking? Because you're not saying anything that makes sense.
Yeah, it's at the point where we're starting to realize that Kosh is trying to be confusing and misleading on purpose. He's not just alien.
Mm-hmm. Ryan says, I also like that we get an answer to what Haig and Sheridan have been up to since the first episode of the season. Oh, that's right. This was the big reveal at the end that Sheridan was sent here as part of the effort to fight back against the president. Man, that sounds like a good idea. We said that there's much more to be concerned about. I'm glad the senior staff is on the same page now.
Yeah.
Not the best of the second season, but I like it. Acts of Sacrifice is not too bad. The stuff I like is that we start to see some of the impacts of the Narn Centauri War, the Ivanova Lomati stuff. I hope other people found it funny. It just didn't land for me. Oh, Acts of Sacrifice. That's where she had the guy who wanted. Yeah. I remember us talking about that. Like we could see where the humor was, but it wasn't exactly funny. I'm glad that she had a good time making the scene, but I don't remember us really enjoying it much, or at least myself. And I thought that your comments resonated, but I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever laughed out loud at that, as I know others have. There are some who have actually said online that scene's why they think it's the funniest episode of the series and the funniest scene of the series. But yeah, it didn't hit like that for me. I just appreciated that she found a loophole to wiggle through.
Right. To wiggle through? Okay. G'Kar looking for aid was pretty tragic. We see that he really is starting to change, but that he isn't trusted as much due to his prior actions. Yes. Unfortunately, it's the innocents who pay the price. Londo, seeing that his new influence isn't all it's cracked up to be, will be careful what you wish for. He has no more friends and no peace. He really didn't think this through all the way. Peter Jurasik does a great job again, but I could probably say that for almost each episode. The last scene between Garibaldi and Londo is bittersweet. Yeah, the cost to Londo for his choices. You know what it makes me think of?
No.
The number at the end of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Are you familiar with the show?
Oh, yes, I've got the Blu-ray.
Yeah, everything you ever wanted, but it cost him so much. Like, obviously not in the same way, but the life that Londo was enjoying, he's had to pretty much give up everything about his life that was good in order to get, quote, what he always wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Londo seeing that his new influences. Oh yeah, I read that part. And well, on to the last episode before another break. Boo, hiss. Until next time. Thank you, Ryan.
All right. And now Mahatma Randy 5977 again comments on YouTube about Acts of Sacrifice. He says, Paul Williams, the self-described gargoyle of rock and roll, does not age. He's playing an early teen in the weird mid-60s black comedy movie The Loved Ones. He was 25 years old at the time, but he looked about 14 or 15. He's 84 now and doesn't look materially different than he did when he started making the show 30 years back. So I'm pretty sure he dyes his hair now. He's also done some voice acting. Easily my favorite is the 1994 Tick cartoon when he played a male supervillain named the Mother of Invention in the episode Leonardo da Vinci and his Fighting Genius Time Commandos. Villains with poorly thought out themes were a running gag on that show. That's a great show. I'm still kind of bitter that Disney announced all 36 episodes in 3 12-volume sets and then canceled it after volume 2 because the sales weren't there. So we never did get volume 3. I hate it when there's only one release left to finish the series and it doesn't come. So kudos to the Sliders people for finally releasing the last season after a decade, even if that season wasn't very good. And there was that same with Gargoyles, still waiting for that final season. But anyway, G'Kar's performance is just monumental here. The crying/laughing scene is genuinely heartrending, and it's also interesting to see just how far he's already come as a character. Season 1 G'Kar wasn't evil per se, but he was ruthless. Here we are a year later, and I can't see him going back to his earlier self. Well, with one lingering exception, I guess. But for me, the line that hit me the hardest was Londo's, "It is good to have friends, is it not, Mr. Garibaldi? Even if maybe only for a little while." I remember watching this for the first time and realizing, holy crap, Garibaldi was almost certainly the only person on the station he trusted implicitly. That was a shocker.
And like that relationship, I mean, yeah, the even just for a little while part is what makes that hard.
Yeah. And Ray wraps up saying, I wouldn't consider the Lumani's opinion to be Darwinian. I would consider it to be objectivist. It's 100% the kind of thing Ayn Rand would have totally gotten behind. And yeah, fun fact, Charles Darwin spoke out against eugenics. Because once he published, people would say, hey, survival of the fittest, that means the best of the best. Let's do this eugenics thing to support Darwinianism. And Darwin came forward saying, no, the fittest species to survive is the most adaptable. To make us more adaptable, we want variety in the gene pool. We should have mixed marriages. We should move away from eugenics. We want all these options on the table.
Mm-hmm. And natural selection is supposed to be just that, natural, not intentional.
Yep. Because you need that. He's right. You need that diversity. So if your environment changes, the species as a whole can adapt. The people who may be the fittest for today's conditions are not the fittest for next year.
Mm-hmm. So that takes us to Ryan Wilson's email about Hunter Prey and comics 1 through 4. Yay, comics. Okay. So he says, Hunter Prey is a pretty decent as a setup episode. Sheridan finally decides to learn about the Vorlons, Kosh specifically, and a doctor has some valuable information to impart. We as viewers get confirmation that the vice president knew about the assassination of the former president. If we are being charitable, maybe Clark is being coerced.
Yeah. You know what? At this point, first-time viewers, that would be an option on the table, right?
Yeah, it never occurred to me. When he pulled out his ship and the president blew up, my very first thought was that was intentional. And every single thing that happened with Clark after that just reinforced that idea. I can see how some people might see that as an option. Cool. But as a first-time viewer, I did not consider that possibility.
Yeah, it'd be almost the classic Final Fantasy storytelling where the villain you think you're up against is not the real villain, and you find out sometime in Act 3. Or in the case of Final Fantasy IX, after you defeat the person you think is the real villain, and then someone appears out of nowhere saying, hey, it's really been me. New fight.
That's Mega Man too.
Yeah.
Sheridan making up downtown as a diversion for the EarthGov team is interesting. He's good on his feet. That was funny. Because Down Below kind of came out of nowhere originally in the first season. Like, I don't think we even got mention of it before it was actually a story point and they went there. And then later on became a commonly referenced place. In theory, downtown could have been a similar storytelling point. But no, it was all just made up. Kosh does not like being asked what he wants. Okay, but what did Mom Kosh do when Kosh was a toddler and she needed to feed him food? Or he was just like, baby and screaming and couldn't say what he wanted. What do you want? What do you want? Did he like run away? I don't know. I wasn't there. We also get confirmation that the Vorlon ship is alive. Not the best of the season, but it's pretty good. And he goes on top of issues 1 through 4. I had never read these issues. I was not a fan until much later in the show's run, so I missed them. Glad you're covering the comics, so it gives me a chance to learn about them. It's interesting that the president knew about the Minbari souls being reborn. I don't think we ever learned that in the show. I think he means I don't think we ever learned that the president knew that in the show, President Clark.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what he means, and I'm pretty sure he's correct. So
yeah. And it's interesting because Clark is almost sympathetic in that scene. He feels like a leader we can look up to and respect. There's very little in that comic story that makes him out to be the POS that he actually is. He's been a bit manipulative of Sinclair, but maybe not more than is common for leaders in military to do in stories.
Yeah. Well, what else do you expect from a point of sale? Sorry, I always do that double take when I hear,
Sorry,
when I'm in like stores and they start talking about POS over the intercom. It takes me a while to realize, oh yeah, two meanings.
It's interesting to see the Extreme Warrior cast group again. I wondered if there was supposed to be more done with them or the Warrior cast in general. I think it helps to inform later developments because the Warrior cast is, I mean, obviously going to be here to stay and play. Naroon just got made part of the council, so
Yeah.
I don't know if he means something else about that. He says the comics are a good way to get into some elements that don't fit or you can't get the actors for. Obviously, Michael O'Hare would not have been available for this story, so it could not have been a TV episode. Looking forward to the rest of the comics and the novels until next time. Yeah, getting the connective tissue between his departure from the show and what all he went on to do. Now, it ends up getting caught up in the murder mystery where he's being accused of murder and doesn't actually have a whole lot to do with what he actually goes on to do on Minbar. But it is a story, so we kind of get a little swan song from the character.
Yeah. We're going to have more from Naroon a few times. So through season 4 and actually one of the novels, at least one. So
as I was reading back through the comics, working out, as I'm re-experiencing everything along pace with the podcast, most of the stuff for the second time, although some of the early stuff was for the third or more. That first comic book arc, other than the first issue, now feels kind of auxiliary. I don't know that there's a whole lot in issues 2 through 4 that had lasting impact. Some, obviously, but not a whole lot. I do find that the next arc that we're going to be covering soon, 5 through 8, that's the part that, like, I think of the entire comic series, that's the arc that feels most resonant with me is the Garibaldi Mars arc.
I would say so. Yeah. We have a lot. They're going to revisit these eras. So like you said, we had some Sinclair story. It may not feel that impactful because we don't see much of Sinclair going forward. But we will see a lot more of him in novel number 9.
Oh, one thing about that first arc is that the new leader of the council is in that arc, and we never see him on screen. He's only passingly mentioned a small number of times. We're much more concerned with the Grey Council. And with developments that I can't really talk about because of spoilers, I feel like the leader of the Grey Council should be playing a part in things, and we just never hear about him. The previous leader, Dukat, he's revered, especially by Delenn, but the next leader never gets talked about. And I just thought it was odd. He does appear on the page in that story.
Yep. It does matter. And that's one thing that Jim has wanted. He wanted the ancillary material, the tie-in media, he did want it to feel like it all mattered. And I think if he'd had higher levels of editorial control, that would have been more consistently true. Mm-hmm. But they all should tell a story that we don't see, but also informs the series, because even the highest selling comic is not going to have the viewership of the TV series. So you can't make enjoy the TV series dependent on reading the comic. But you do want the people who've invested in the comic to feel rewarded for having done so. At least that was Straczynski's attitude, which I appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
We have one other piece of feedback on the coverage of the first 4 comics, and that is a YouTube comment from Mahatma Randy 5977. He says, "Oh, I've been looking forward to this."
But Randy, were you looking backward to it afterwards? Did you have thoughts? Share us your insights.
Yes, especially if you've read the other issues, because we will be covering the rest of this 11-issue series before the next episode was broadcast.
All right, so that takes us to Mahatma Randy's next comment, which was about feedback special number 5. I love it when we get feedback on our feedback. It's like thoughts about their thoughts about our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
A Rip Van Winkle story with science fiction tropes rather than sleepy tropes. Brilliant. Weirdly, I never thought of it this way before. One of Roddenberry's dictates was that makeup couldn't cover the face, resulting in the TNG era prosthetic forehead aliens, which, with few exceptions, always bored me. It bored the makeup designers, I'm pretty sure, too, because they just had to come up with different foreheads and stuff. And I think by the time we get to Deep Space Nine, we finally get some more face covering makeup. But TNG, yeah, it's all just weird ridges and bumps and spots and colors. At the time when the show aired, I loved the alien makeup and prosthetics because it was so much better and imaginative and well done. I remember showing pictures to friends who bagged in Babylon 5 without ever seeing it. I think it bagged on means they stopped watching or didn't start watching, and how fake everything looked. And I showed them some pictures of Jakar and they shut up. Then he says 10 or 15 episodes to tell a story. Really? Most of the streamers I see are like 6 or 8 episodes.
Yeah, the number has shrunken since it first started. Like all the Netflix Marvel series, the first seasons of Daredevil, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, all those started as 13 episodes each.
Yeah, I remember 13 felt like a standard. And then things started getting smaller. 10 started becoming more common. And yeah, now 8. And what's difficult is that they're putting a lot of money and time into those 6, 8, or 10 episodes. And so it'll take 2 years to get another 6, 8, or 10 episodes. And sadly, angrily, The Wheel of Time is not getting its 4th season. Very upset by this when it was announced last week.
Oh yeah, so many people going, wait a minute, that's gone and Rings of Power is still here, and it's not a matter of the quality of the show, it's a matter of the profitability of the show. So when you have a more expensive show with a smaller viewer base, yeah, it's going to go away, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, also Rings of Power was renewed before a certain person made a lot of certain budgetary changes to the national economic climate.
Yeah.
Or rather, the international economic climate.
Yep, and that's part of the reason we're still trying to find out how long it'll be before Doctor Who comes back, because Disney doesn't know if they're going to continue to support Doctor Who. And anyone listening, if you fell out for a while, Ncuti Gatwa killed it. Go back, check it out. It's bringing in a lot more of the classic elements. It is worth revisiting.
Yeah. My wife has not really watched a lot of Doctor Who. She likes the idea, but she watched the 2 Ncuti Gatwa episodes with me, or seasons with me, and loved it. Even whenever they delved into, past continuity and stuff, it was, I was able to give her like, a sentence or two of that's what this is. She's like, okay, we just kept on going. So yeah, fun stuff. And to wrap up, Mahatma Randy's last comment, he says, I took these orders differently from the president. I'm sorry, these orders come directly from the president to mean just the transfer to Babylon 5. The spy mission itself came from Haig.
Yeah. I don't know if I made that ambiguous or not when we were discussing it, but I read it the same way.
Yeah.
So, all right. And our next feedback is also from Mahatma Randy, this time on our coverage of the first novel, Voices. There's a line in an episode where Talia is puttering around her apartment and says, pardon the mess, we just had a convention. I'm sorry, I can't remember which episode. I want to say a spider in the web, but I don't think that's right. So yeah, I missed that watching, but he's pointing that out, that yeah, she did mention it, so it's tying in to the novel and kind of places it right there. Should probably check the preamble to the novel, because it does say it takes place between, after this episode and before that one. Probably takes place just before that one episode. Although you think, given the way that played out for Talia, the convention would be the least of her concerns at that stage.
Yeah, I think the window that the novel gives is definitely earlier in the season, because the window that it gives is before the novel itself was published, and the novel was out by the time that episode came out. So the placement of the novel in the timeline is going to be a little bit sticky, but like we talked about in that episode, I think it's reasonable that they abandoned attempts to interconnect the novels and the show, because the production pipeline is just so different, and confusions like that are the least of the possible things that could happen.
Yep. Randy continues, I always thought Harriman Gray was a great noir detective name alongside Nero Wolfe, Rex Stout, Sam Spade, etc. I've had to actively resist stealing it and using it in some of my own stories. Yeah, it is a great name. And sometimes that happens. In Ninjas and Bots, John and Lane keep talking about a Transformer who'd have a great name for a detective series, and there actually was one. I think it's Nightbeat. Was that the...
Nightbeat, yeah.
Yeah, there actually was an old-time radio show called Night Beat
Haha.
about a reporter who ended up solving a lot of mysteries.
Herman Gray is a good name, though. He's right. It's a good name. And Nero Wolfe and Rex Stout. My dad had a collection of Nero Wolfe novels. And the first of those, which I believe is Fer-de-Lance, is possibly the only actual pure detective novel that I've ever read.
Oh,
Well, except for the one that you sent me that was less pure detective and more kind of quirky, but
Mhm.
it's in the genre.
Oh, yes, the Finder of Lost Persons by
Mm-hmm.
Chalmers, yeah. We will probably be talking about Nero Wolfe again when we get to our coverage of Jake and the Fat Man.
Gotcha.
All right, so now the biggest part of Randy's comment is this. First of all, thank you guys again for doing this tie-in media. It really was part of the experience of the days when the show was actually airing. I remember reading an interview with JMS. I think it was in SFU magazine, though I really don't remember, where he was talking about the tie-ins before they started coming out. He expressed his annoyance with how tie-in media never counted, and he felt that was a cheat and just kind of a waste of everyone's time. He figured it wouldn't be too hard for him to ride herd on novels and comics and keep the show going, so that would all be canonical. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be the case, and ultimately most of the stuff was ruled non-canonical in retrospect. That's also why the comic and novel series ended rather abruptly. Of the two, I think the comics have far less issues with canonicity. Yeah, I think in the end, 2 of the, or 1.5 of the first 9 novels are considered canon, while 9 of the 11 comic issues are.
Mm-hmm.
Randy continues, for what it's worth, while the show was running, all of these novels were considered 100% real, at least officially, though it was pretty obvious as the series went along that they weren't really. Anyway, in the interview, he was clearly pretty excited about it. He said that the authors were free to tell pretty much any stories they wanted, so long as it didn't break the rules of the universe and involved at least one of our characters. Then he said, in fact, it didn't even have to feature existing characters, so long as it was a story worth telling, set somewhere in the universe at roughly the same time as the show. I don't know, listening to him talk about it, I was pretty pumped. Then I read Voices, and yeah. I thought to myself something snarky like, I'll have to reread the article and see if he specified that the story had to be good. I don't think he did. You guys were much kinder to this novel than I was. I found the whole thing rather tedious, apart from the Invisible Isabel stuff. 10 or 12 years ago, I saw a chart, long since lost, that showed what was and wasn't canonical, apparently according to JMS himself. In some cases, it was as little as 1 sentence, and I think one of the novels had exactly nothing canonical in them. I'm going to guess that was novel 5, for reasons that will be way more clear when you hear our coverage of it. But that kind of had nothing in it, period. So yeah, I do agree a lot of tie-in novels don't feel super consequential. I think the Star Wars novels are more likely to get away with that because the series was so episodic, a lot of the actual episodes were inconsequential. So it still feels of a piece.
You said Star Wars, are you meaning Star Trek?
Oh, yes, I meant Star Trek. In contrast, Star Wars, like it starts with the trilogy and then the tie-in starts coming in. So that one, again, you'd feel a little more like there's canonicity because it started as a continuing story.
Mm-hmm. And there was also so little to tie into. You just had to take the movie and tell more adventures of those characters. As long as you were consistent with what happened in the movie, it felt like real stuff.
Yeah. At least Star Trek, to their credit, they didn't pretend that the stuff was going to be canon. They were always saying the ancillary media is just fun for a long time, at least not until the Treklit universe. They weren't saying, no, this matters. Treklit was the closest, whereas Star Wars, when that started in the 90s with Heir to the Empire, Lucas was saying, yes, this is what happens next, which is why he did episodes 1, 2, 3 instead of 7, 8, 9, because he was kind of leaving 7, 8, 9 and that era to the tie-in media.
Well, no, the tie-in media were not allowed to go more than 30 years in the future because that's when 7, 8, 9 were supposed to take place.
Okay.
So they actually had a boundary. If he ever did 7, 8, and 9, and this is what he said in the 90s and 2000s, if he ever did 7, 8, and 9, he didn't want them to go into that, realm. But of course, once they decided to do 7, 8, and 9, they decided everything up to that point was going to have to get scrapped, which is a pros and cons kind of decision.
Yeah, from a business perspective, I get why making 789 not tied to the continuity of novels that were read by 1% of the population you want to appeal to, if that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially since a lot of them were going to buy their tickets no matter what. But at the same time, I also get why a lot of those people who wanted to buy those tickets felt like it was a slap in the face because they'd invested hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in all this tie-in media, and then were told, yeah, it's all in the dumpster.
But as somebody who's done DC Comics and other kinds of things where there were multiple continuities, I just thought, oh, this is Tuesday. You want to tell stories that and not be beholden to 30 years of continuity? Okay. So we're going to call this the Crisis or the Flashpoint or the whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. It still blows me away that, for you it was important. For me, it was Tuesday. That starts with the Street Fighter movie, believe it or not. I've seen people who are looking into it and they can't find that dialogue older than that movie. And it didn't seem to make a huge splash for a lot of people, but that line had impact.
That line had impact.
Yeah.
Our next piece of feedback comes from Stuart Wald 2395, and he says on YouTube about episode 14, "There All the Honor Lies." He says, "And you didn't think that a Narn could be an attorney?"
Yep, that's what he says.
I don't remember thinking that a Narn couldn't be an attorney.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he was just a general you and not necessarily you and I. I don't remember that comment either, but yeah. All right, from there, our next piece of feedback is an email from Scott McFadden covering episodes 14 and 15. So that's There All the Honor Lies and Now for a Word. So Scott says, "Hi guys, sorry I haven't written in a bit." Oh, no problem, Scott. It's always appreciated when you do, but we totally understand that lives are busy and it won't be every time.
No, I'm charging him. I mean, he had the room. He just chose not to sleep in it. Just kidding. Go ahead.
Thanks for the coverage of the B5 comics and the first novel. I appreciated hearing about them, even though I've never read them. For whatever reason, I've never been one to follow tie-in media. It was nice to find out that the comic series did a bit more with Sinclair and his sudden transfer away from the station. I'm glad they did what they could to explore that situation, even if they weren't able to do it on the show itself. Aside, we'll see a lot more of Sinclair after his transfer in Novel 9. That's pretty much what the whole thing is about. Back to Scott's email. As for There All the Honor Lies, it is a good reminder of JMS's time with Murder, She Wrote. It is one of those old standbys. Our hero is falsely accused of murder. What gives it a twist is Lanier and his clan connection to the accuser. The sort of honor culture that the Minbari represent is something that Jessica Fletcher didn't have to deal with, and it provides an additional challenge when interviewing witnesses. But it also ultimately provides the solution, as Lanier is able to leverage that clan loyalty and extract a confession. As you say, the technique of tricking the guilty party into confessing while the authorities are waiting just outside is very Murder, She Wrote. Although, as we've learned from recent history, the most unbelievable part of this episode is the idea of even having a complete confession on tape would convince anyone who didn't want to be convinced. Yep. Yeah, the confirmation bias and tribal loyalty are strong in our DNA. Londo was very likable in this episode, both in the way he supports Veer and in the way he casually reveals that the Minbari will indeed lie if it's for the right reason. This is the amiable Londo of old. Alas, the same cannot be said of Londo's role in And Now for a Word.
Sorry, because it's such a switch, right? Because we had Londo of old. And, granted, the stuff that he dealt with in There All the Honor Lies was not so much him having to be leaders, political or otherwise, within the Centauri people. But yeah, then we get a very good big switch for Londo.
Yeah, There All the Honor Lies. He's helping someone he wants to consider a friend in something that would have little or no consequence to the Centauri Empire, aside from keeping Sheridan in the station, which is something Londo probably wants. He's familiar with him. He respects him. Right. And then in Now for a Word, well, the propaganda machine is full steam ahead. Continuing Scott's email, he says, like John, I found Londo deeply sinister and downright scary in this episode, utilizing his diplomatic skills in a horrible cause. This is a wonderful episode in the way that it demonstrates how easily truth can be manipulated. They do an especially good job in the way that G'Kar is treated, showing him as angry and short-tempered. It's a sad fact that we seem to distrust anger, even coming from someone who has plenty to be angry about. We know that G'Kar is capable of controlling his emotions when he needs to, so we have to assume that showing only the growly and frustrated G'Kar is a deliberate choice on the part of Cynthia Torkmian. By the way, thanks for pointing out the similarity of her name to Torquemada. I never made that connection on my own. In sharp contrast, Londo appears calm and reasonable throughout. Very deliberately, his recounting of Centauri Narn history echoes the colonialist language of Earth's own history. They were a primitive people, and we brought them civilization, and so forth. Not easy to listen to, but very on point. As always, Peter Jurasik does great work in this episode.
And he'll say those things calmly and eloquently, while at the same time doing so many dastardly things off camera, whenever he's not being interviewed. It's an example, and this is not the point that was made in the episode. I feel like it helps to illustrate the conceit that if you can make your point without being overly emotional, you are more valid than if you make your point being overly emotional. And I say overly, but more. Even though his point is repugnant, it comes off as the better stance, just because of the way it's presented. And that's a difficult thing about how we respond to people speaking, that I think about half the population of the planet often has troubles grappling with.
Yeah, and something else I've learned that's even more disturbing, people are more naturally inclined to trust video than pure text. So I think that's why we're having issues with misinformation on YouTube trumping things like newspapers. So Randy continues, the plot may be a little contrived just in the fact that this crisis happens exactly when the ISN news crew happens to be visiting. So exactly that the shooting starts precisely as they arrive. But those kind of contrivances are necessary in fiction. Besides, we get the feeling that Torkman came in with an anti-B5 agenda and would have found something to stir up controversy no matter what was going on. I agree. I've heard as a general rule you're allowed one big coincidence in your story, and I'd say that the arrival to the point that when they're filming the station from outside, things go on, that's their one big coincidence. Scott concludes, quite a good pair of episodes, looking forward to more.
But we have more. They are coming.
Oh, yes. Quite a few more. There's 110 in total, and we've at that point discussed 37. So that's before we count Crusade.
And then Mahatma Randy says about, and now for a word, he says, that's a very good observation about the attack interview on Delenn. Seen this episode a bunch of times, but I never really thought about it that way before. To be honest, I always thought that part of the episode was a little stagey compared to the rest of it. But now that you point out that it was a hit piece, suddenly it clicks better in my brain. I don't really know how I never got that on my own. So now I'm thinking it through. This is 11 years after humanity was all almost rendered extinct, and we don't know how many people actually died in the war. Maybe it was just a few score thousand, maybe it was millions. But most of the human population lives on Earth, and most of the audience watching this show would have looked up at the night sky during the Battle of the Line and actually seen explosions and stuff like that, and heard horrific announcements from the government over TV and radio, and would have known they were going to die, and then didn't. But that's not the kind of thing that a person forgets, and it's not the accounting that most people could forgive. So I'm now wondering if the attack on Delenn was just a personal grudge on the part of the reporter, or if it might be a matter of official policy. Always make the Minbari look bad. It's good for ratings. Interesting. I think it could be both. And I know it's not the same kind of thing, but it kind of is the same kind of thing emotionally. But I'm thinking like if we got, I don't want to say this, in say 2011, 2012, if we did some big interview with representatives of some of the splinter Muslim groups, and the reporters in New York City would just attack them, and not give them a chance to say their position. And I know that that's maybe a charged concept, but of course this is reality as opposed to Babylon 5. but I was wondering if it's a similar kind of dynamic.
Yeah, it's possible.
Muhammad Randy goes on to say, I don't believe I caught the different eye lines and lighting in the interview with Senator Cantrell, at least not consciously. That kind of thing is done accidentally quite a bit in television, so I might have just glossed over it in my brain, or I might be wildly unobservant. When I was watching it again before our podcast release and not remembering that we have talked about that, I did not notice there being such a huge difference. We're going to have a similar conversation about a later episode where such kinds of shifts and changes are much more noticeable, but not so much in this one to my eye. At least, no, without consciously thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it is fairly subtle because, as you said, a lot of fiction gets it wrong, especially in some of the science fiction nowadays where people are acting opposite tennis balls. And, the eye line isn't there because I haven't figured out where the thing they're talking to's eyes are going to be. See also Star Wars prequels. But in a news broadcast, there's no reason the eye lines shouldn't line up. To me, the eye lines, I didn't notice. I read about it. The thing I did notice was the change in audio quality, because when you're recording in a different room, it does sound different.
Mm-hmm.
So
he goes on to say, in the short-lived British TV series Around the World with Orson Welles, he did a lot of that sort of thing. He would shoot an interview. Frequently, he would just shoot a celebrity guest talking randomly about stuff, and then he would insert reaction shots of himself as though they were amiably chatting back and forth. He would even edit the sound a little bit, so sometimes his comments would clip over the top of theirs and vice versa, as though it were a live conversation. They were both talking at once. It was pretty fascinating to see because he did it in a way that made the conversations seem very vivacious and engaging and kind of glamorous. The guest could have just been talking about how she likes growing her own potatoes in Spain, but he would cut it in such a way that it made it seem like they were bouncing jokes off of each other and we're best pals and have known each other forever. That's not really relevant to Babylon 5. It's just kind of interesting. No, it's good. There was once in a podcast episode where I had a guest on, and I didn't want to go through all the feedback for the episode with the guest there because the guest wasn't involved in the previous episode. But I did want to have a feedback segment in the episode. And so what I did is I introduced the episode. We did our opening banter. And then I inserted a segment where Josh and Don and I talked about the feedback. And as we're coming out of the last feedback and we're all kind of laughing, I grabbed an audio of the guest also laughing and added it in to the sound mix. So it sounded like they were there at the end of the feedback as we segued back into the regular conversation recording. So a very, very small thing. But I remember Josh and Don mentioning it later that they noticed it and thought it was a cool touch to kind of make it feel more natural. So I get it. Muhammad Randy concludes, I think Clark did rise in popularity since he took office. Of course he did. Remember, Santiago was expected to lose the re-election in 2258. Winning is explicitly because he put Clark on his ticket late in the run because the Psi Corps endorsed Clark. I don't remember that being a point.
I remember them pointing out that for the first time ever, Psi Corps has endorsed a candidate. So and I remember them talking, not necessarily who's expected to lose, but that it was a very tight election. And that he had, I think they even mentioned that he'd recently chosen Clark as his running mate, but I don't remember dialogue saying that that is what propelled him. But yeah, if that happened, it would have been the first episode or two, which I haven't seen in a while. And the next episode we're recording is mid-season 4. So
it's the first episode of the season proper. The election's going on in the first episode. And I do remember that all of the people on the station were, at least the ones who voiced an opinion, except for Garibaldi, were expecting the other person to win. Ivanova especially was not a fan of Santiago. Even less so of.
Yes, because she's Russian. She thinks the leader should have a strong chin, and Santiago had none, and Clark had several. This to her was not a good combination. Right. The dialogue I clearly remember.
So most people expected the other person to win. It was kind of a surprise. And I remember us having conversations then that Santiago, who even in that context came off as the more xenophobic of the two, to have him win felt like a loss. And then, of course, to have his even worse running mate assume the presidency after his assassination is, of course, not great. So he probably had a little bit of political cachet on his own before he got put on the ticket. That's not at all uncommon in politics. We have seen repeatedly that there is a substantial amount of anti-alien sentiment on Earth, and a lot of people have not forgiven the Minbari. Earth in Babylon 5 is basically the U.S. writ large, yeah. And there has always been an element of America first, isolationists, xenophobes, and stealth authoritarians in the U.S. America as a whole was very isolationist until the 20th century. Like, we had no interest in being involved in foreign politics until the 20th century. And I think Roosevelt was the first person who tried to turn America into a international power. He wanted to be an empire like the other, powers of old. And that started our involvement in larger affairs that have now since gone as they have gone. So naturally, there are in the Earth Alliance as well. In 1995, this was just a cautionary tale. In 2025, well, I'm writing this at the end of a week in which NPR, PBS, and RFE all just got killed, meaning that every news service in the U.S. is now corporate.
Yeah.
2025.
Yep. Yes, we are. Like we said, this one is being recorded live. So if you're listening to it after finding the podcast later, we are listening to this when Musk and Trump are having their public divorce during Pride Month here.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's the kind of thing that we can. Sadly, part of the reason Babylon 5 resonates is because we've all seen so much like it in the real world. All right. Our next comment is from Stuart Wald about In the Shadow of Zachadum. And he says, you watch this episode, then you reread The Shadow of the Past, Chapter 2 of The Fellowship of the Ring. Then you smack yourself on the head for having missed the big picture until now.
That is the exposition central capital of the world.
Yeah.
Is Chapter 2 of that section of the Lord of the Ring.
Yep. And Straczynski said he doesn't have nearly as much time to read as he would like because he spends so much time writing. But the one book he rereads every year is Lord of the Rings. So if you're looking, you will see a lot of similarities.
Mm.
Okay.
And nearing the... no, we're not.
Yeah, we're about halfway.
We're nearing the end. Halfway is good.
Yep.
We're at the 1 hour mark. So, we might do pretty well with this. Mahatma Randi says to In the Shadows of Hadum, ooh, somebody needs to do a Land of the Lost podcast. Mahatma Randi, be the change you want to see in the world.
I have the original series on DVD, all 3 seasons. It's a tough one to binge. They were swinging for the fences, but Sid and Marty Krofft had budget constraints.
Yeah. I remember that feeling from the show, is that this wants to be more than it is. He says, Veer's backbone. Back in the Technomage episode, Londo sends Veer to arrange a meeting with the Technomages. My name is Veer Kato, attaché to Ambassador Londo Mollari. I'm told by the people running that way that this is where I can find the Technomages. They try to scare him off with Hocus Pocus, and he just keeps saying his name and title over and over, and he eventually backs out. But the thing is, he didn't run. And that's the first time I think we see Veer's spine. This is the second time, and it's way more memorable. Veer is easily scared, but he absolutely will do his job just the same. And while he clearly can't act on it, we see that he's a creature of conscience. I think also being fueled by as much hatred as he has for Morden helped bring out his confidence in that. Whereas the Technomages, they're just scary. He doesn't know what he's getting into.
Yeah, and I think in that point, he was also trapped between a rock and a hard place because he would be also scared of going back to Londo without talking to the Technomages. So, yeah, there's that. Whereas, yeah, standing up to Morden, he had some courage in the first one, but the real backbone where he's pushing back hard against something pushing him and something that's wrong. yeah, we really see that with Morden.
Mahat Miranda goes on to say, something that doesn't get mentioned too much when people talk about this episode, but which you touched on, is that it paints Garibaldi as a creature of conscience as well. Up until now, we've known him as an amiable, somewhat paranoid 5-time loser and recovering alcoholic who will bend the rules now and again, letting Ivanova off for misuse of the gold channels, smuggling in food for his Italian fondue, going easy on Londo for having an illegal weapon on the station, stalking Talia, etc. That'd be going easy on himself for being a bad man. We've seen that he's brave and that he's the kind of guy who will sacrifice a lot for doing the right thing, or at least what he believes is the right thing. We've never actually seen that there is a line he won't cross. And now we know what it is. He will not allow police authority to be exceeded. Yeah, police authority getting exceeded. That was a conversation at this point in the 90s. Because police brutality on videotape had definitely become a thing recently. And, yeah. Now, of course, 2025, we have all sorts of things happening, and people in California protesting the federal building because of all the illegal arrests that have been done. But, it's a dumpster fire out there. So Mahat Miranda says, good for Garibaldi. We also see that he's considerably more rational than Sheridan in this episode. It's not coincidental that the Night Watch was introduced in this episode. This is not a spoiler, but there are some interesting, subtle, perhaps accidental echoes of some of the events in this episode much later in the series. It's interesting how quickly Sheridan goes all draconian and authoritarian and amoral. Really, about the only good thing we can say about his behavior through the bulk of this episode is that he didn't beat the crap out of Morden while he was in custody. Yes, because this is the one where, I forgot the context of the Garibaldi conversation. This is the one where Sheridan wants to know what happened to his wife, and he is willing to break Morden's bones to get that information, and Garibaldi won't let him.
Yeah, Garibaldi is the one saying, you have to draw the line. You cannot do this. How much of that was Garibaldi protecting Morgan? How much of that was protecting the process? And how much of that was protecting Sheridan from crossing the wrong line and ending his career? Mm-hmm. We don't know exactly, how much each of those elements weighed into his decision. I'm guessing what we know of Garibaldi in the long term, all three of those were factors that were driving him. Yeah. It was interesting to see. And like you're saying, that sets borders for Garibaldi that we didn't have yet.
A lot of I'm going to try to keep this obscure, but if it's not obscure enough, cut it. A lot of the things I think he's referring to later in the series seem to primarily refer to developments that happen later in the series and the way people are seeing changes in other people. But I can definitely see, even though they don't say it on the screen, I can see how that can harken back to stuff like this, where Garibaldi sees Sheridan here and is like, you know what? That's more than you should be doing, sir.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Can't really say a whole lot more about that.
No, and I'm not going to either, because Randy may also be referring to episodes you haven't seen yet.
Oh. Well, I thought I was all knowledgeable and stuff. Evidently, I'm still in the dark on a whole season and a half worth of show. Okay. And yeah, the last thing he says is history never repeats, but it does sometimes rhyme, is a Mark Twainism. I think that's the line that George Lucas was trying to refer to, but said it in a way that gets kind of mocked in his description of the Star Wars saga cycle. Anyways.
Okay. That's the line. The first time I read that line in text, I read it in Guardians of the Galaxy, written by Abnett and Lanning. So sometimes I've cited that there. He may be responding to clarify that for me, because I made that error multiple times. I don't remember if I made it in that episode or not, but it's entirely possible. Our next piece of feedback is from Simon Giles. It's also a YouTube comment on In the Shadow of Zahadum. And he says, this is the first time I've heard anyone else notice that Zach falling asleep during World War II history may be why he doesn't see anything sinister about the Night Watch. Yeah, because sinister things are happening. Who knew that to get a job with the park rangers these days. Part of the application form is asking for your favorite policy or executive order from current sitting president.
Wow.
Uh-huh. And
I'll let you take the next one because you've had 2 shorties in a row.
Okay. Yes, and that we don't have to.
I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, that's okay. I was just going to go on another off-topic thing about how there's now polygraph loyalty tests happening in the park rangers department too, possibly because the administration doesn't like that so many of the park rangers are going, yeah, people, this is what's happening on the inside. Seriously, find that alt park ranger national park account on social media. It's amazing. Anyway, we also have an email from Scott McFadden about In the Shadow of Zahadum. He says, hello, fellas. At last, I've had a chance to catch up on my podcast listening. All this is 3 separate emails since each episode has a lot of heft to them, and I don't want to overwhelm you with one big message. I hope they get to you in time for the feedback episode. Well, they will always be to us in time for a feedback episode. If we keep getting that feedback on the feedback that John loves, this podcast may never end. So I guess I should start by acknowledging the recent passing of Peter David. He was one of my favorite writers, not just, and if I'm honest, not primarily for his work on B5, but more for his Star Trek novels and his comic book work, particularly his runs on The Incredible Hulk and Supergirl. It's a particular pity that despite his years of success, he ended up having to do a GoFundMe for his medical expenses. But I suppose that's another discussion. Yeah, he's got so much. You could throw in Sir Apropos of Nothing. You could throw in X Factor. You could throw in Spider-Man. Peter David did a lot of really good work in a lot of fields over the years.
And maybe we should just go ahead and say this now, because later on we're going to refer to writers who have had significant developments, like Peter David having passed. We're not going to mention them at the time because we recorded those episodes years previous. So in future, and Blaine's pretty good about editing some stuff out that maybe we don't want to have said after the fact. But if you hear us mention a writer and we don't refer to significant developments, it's possibly just because they hadn't happened yet when we recorded the episode. But it's definitely why.
It is. Actually, I was intending to record a little disclaimer for the first episode where the games show up, because the first time we mentioned Neil Gaiman on the podcast was, I think I looked into it. The news about what kind of person he actually is, and that element. Yeah, that news first broke 4 hours and 17 minutes after we stopped our recording.
And that's not even like the confirmation follow-up, but just like the very first indications. That podcast that went up was 4 hours and 70 minutes after our podcast was recorded.
Yeah. So we'll have a disclaimer on there, and you will hear our thoughts about it in season 5, because he does write an episode for the show that we haven't recorded yet. So I think that's
although interesting to point out, the game. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to talk over you.
I think when he does the full episode, that's the next time we need to mention him, and that's when we will make our dissatisfaction with his personal choices abundantly clear.
I don't plan to go into all of that, but we could just,
yeah.
But I did want to point out that the game actually do make a passing appearance in an episode that has already come out, because I pointed them out to Mindy whenever we saw them. I forget which one it was now, but they're just like, they pass by in front of the camera, and I paused it. It's like, hey, you recognize that guy? So that was neat.
Anyway, yeah, and Peter David, at least Peter David, it's come out that yesterday when he made bad comments about the Romani, it's because his mother believed lies that she passed on to him when he was too young to question what his mother was saying. So he made very public derogatory comments. And then a while later on his blog said, okay, I looked into it and found out that what I was told and what I was judging them by was not true. And he did issue an apology. So that, to me, trying to be the better person there and understanding that, this is what his mom told him when he was 6 and he didn't question it. That is much better than that's a better pattern than what we see from other corners.
Growth is always a good thing.
Yes. Similar ideas to how my 99 Years 100 podcast or 100 Years podcast that I do with Trey Hooks about, all the Best Picture winners. That podcast would not exist had Roman Polanski been the winner anytime he was nominated, because I just can't watch his stuff. I see his name in credits, and then 20 minutes into the movie, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a movie playing. Anyway, so back to Scott McFadden's email about the show. As far as In the Shadow of Zahadum goes, of course it's an amazing episode and contains probably my favorite speech of the entire series. I referred to Veer's speech to Morden, of course. It's even more remarkable to learn that this was a last-minute addition. I can only imagine what that scene would have been like if it had been done with Londo. Probably nothing nearly as interesting. Functionally, the only purpose of that first scene is to establish that Morden is on the station. Making it a confrontation between Morden and Veer allows JMS to add a nice character beat for Veer. Yeah, I would agree that had it been Londo, it would have been much more collaborative a conversation than it was. So Veer really...
Yeah, I think having Veer there served that character a lot more than obviously his absence, but we would have gotten less overall out of the scene if it had been Londo, because we've seen them before.
Yep. Scott continues, Veer really shines in this episode, both in standing up to Morden and to a lesser extent in standing up to Sheridan. We all know that Veer hates Morden and would be only too happy to see him rot in a jail cell for the rest of his life. But he does his job, insisting that Morden be released, which requires him to potentially piss off Sheridan. Veer, despite his natural diffident nature, is good at his job. Yes, he is. Scott says, I think it's very interesting to listen to what Morden says during that first conversation with Veer. He's surprised that Veer isn't more grateful to him and his associates, since they've enabled the Centauri to regain some of the power and success that they once enjoyed. I don't think this is just an attempt to manipulate or shame Veer. It seems to me that Morden is genuinely confused that Veer isn't happy about what's going on. It's like he can't imagine that someone might not want their people to be a conquering force in the galaxy. The notion of wanting to live at peace with other cultures is completely alien to him, no pun intended. Sheridan goes to some dark places in this episode. It's understandable given what's at stake for him, but it's still not good to see. Well, funny isn't the word exactly, but it's kind of darkly amusing the way that so many people keep approaching him one after the other to reproach him for what he's doing. Franklin makes the most humane argument, focusing on what Sheridan is doing to himself, but it's Delenn who finally gets through to him by telling him and us what the shadows are. Yay, info dumps.
Well, it's always that strategy in writing of having a scene serve more than one purpose. She's able to make the emotional plea that works, which moves the story forward, but also gives information to the viewer. Kind of like the Veer scene at the beginning of it not only serves to establish Morden's presence and what he needs to be doing in the episode, but as opposed to a Londo appearance, it gives us a chance to move Veer's story and insight forward as well. So yeah, serving two purposes in a scene is always a good technique.
It is, yes. Scott concludes by saying, so much is going on that the introduction of the Night Watch goes almost unnoticed. It's typical of JMS to slip something like that into an episode when we're busy watching the other plotline. More on the next episode of my next email, Scott.
I am not entirely certain that I would have keyed into the Night Watch as even being significant if it weren't for the podcast. Because the way it is played in that episode is so much of we're just keeping an eye on things. It's no big deal. Just keep doing what you're doing. The blasé presentation of the recruiters implies that it's a blasé development in the story, which is not a criticism. I think that was very intentional, but just to say that, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily notice it if you didn't know you're supposed to notice it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that everything?
Yep.
Okay. So we have from FSM Dog, I'm sorry. Let's say that again. We have from FSM Dog, In the Shadow of Zahadum, says, much foreshadowing. Yes.
Yes.
It is much more shadow. There are shadows for us.
Hmm.
And then Simon Giles talking about, knives. Detilio given the episode after the big arc episode once again. DKO after Signs and Portents. Gropos after the Coming of Shadows. Surprised he didn't make this one an abbreviation as well. Mind you, if this and the last one were swapped, it's less of a change in intensity, and it also means a solid row of 6 really good JMS episodes until the end of the season. I hadn't realized that pattern was going on there, but Knives is almost an abbreviation because it's such a short title.
Yeah, he does go for that. Mahatma Randy also has comments on Knives left on YouTube. He says, if I recall correctly, B5 communicates with Earth and somewhere by tachyon transmission relays. So yeah, that is what they do to get around the light speed limit and have conversations that don't require waiting days for responses to one question. The physics of baseball on a rotating space habitat has always interested me. I can't imagine a way where the balls would behave like they do on Earth. Throw to one side and the ball adds its own acceleration to that of the station and goes down quicker. Throw it the opposite direction and its own velocity subtracts from the rotational velocity of the station and it goes much further. Throw it in a straightforward line and its own velocity changes continually over the course of the arc. I would imagine a baseball would be corkscrewing its way through the sky and it'd be damn hard to catch or throw. Yeah, I think that would be an element. Yeah.
So before you, as a physicist, as the more knowledgeable physicist than I, within a system that is maintaining velocity, everything is going to behave under expected performances. Now, I realize this is a rotational velocity that's being maintained, not a linear velocity that's being maintained. So how is that going to happen? Is the baseball, when you throw it, is it going to think that it's in a constant system, or is it going to drift apparently to the other people who are spinning around?
It is going to drift and actually start to rotate more on its own axis because angular momentum is conserved. So when it's sort of attached to the outer hull, it will have a certain amount of angular momentum from that rotation they're using to simulate gravity. But when you let go, it loses that. So the same Coriolis force that we have on Earth that produces prevailing winds, right? The hurricanes and everything, there's a perfectly symmetrical drain will drain one way in North America and another way in South America. I say perfectly symmetrical, almost all basins will end up draining the same way. Right? If you get a North American basin, they're angled, and it's going to work that way in the Southern Hemisphere. More like when you're draining the bathtub, that'll spiral different directions. That Coriolis force may be of greater impact when you're dealing with gravity level rotations. So it could be like there's always a side wind. So if you're doing a fast straight shot with very little altitude change, you're not going to notice as much as if you lob it. So if you're, hitting a home run, you'd see a lot more of this impact than throwing a pitch. But
so if we were very sensitive to angular velocity and momentum, everything, walking forward down the axis of Babylon 5, would we feel a drift to the side as we were walking forward?
We could, yeah. As it stands, the average person, I did the math in a third year course. If you just jump straight up in the air and try to land where you initially came from, you will actually shift by less than a millimeter, but you will have a shift from that Coriolis force and from the conservation of angular momentum, because as you change your radius, you change the angular velocity. This is why figure skaters will spin faster when they pull their arms in and slow down when they push their arms out. It's preserving that angular momentum when you have more distance to cover. So we'd have similar effects here. I haven't done all the detailed math, but yes, it would have an impact. I suspect it would also have an impact in football because you tend to throw that ball long distances. So that long high pass would also see the Coriolis effects.
Interesting. Okay. So, but our world is so vast and the change in radius is so relatively small that it's not really detectable, whereas the radius of Babylon 5 is significantly smaller. And so the differences are going to be more relatively notable.
Yeah. Yeah, that also means
Okay.
pretty much any time you see them out in that wide open central corridor, you should have a faint breeze going. Everyone's hair should be flapping in that wind because it's tight enough that
Interesting.
2 meter difference should produce a general or a gentle breeze on your face that you don't feel on your feet.
Gotcha.
Anyway, Randy continues, I completely agree with you when you say that the energy creature felt very Star Trek. Honestly, this whole episode felt very Star Trek to me. As you say, the energy creature feels like a lame TNG episode from the first 2 seasons, and quite frankly, the stuff with Honor and Swords and Londo just felt like a pointless Klingon episode either from TNG or Deep Space Nine. Conceptually, Londo having to betray more of his past and his values and friends is interesting, but in execution, the only thing I found terribly interesting about it was that it was apparently to keep Bravari, the drink, in a safe. Really, you could have cut this entire episode and nothing would have been lost from the overall arc of the series or even the arc of the season. Also, isn't it illegal to have weapons on Babylon 5? You can argue that with Londo's diplomatic credentials, allow him to have at least a ceremonial and decorative weapons, sure. But given how much trouble he almost got in for having a pistol hidden in his apartment, I have a hard time believing that Garibaldi or Sheridan would allow a duel to the death to take place on the station, even if it is an internal Centauri matter. If I recall correctly, the energy creature was only there to remind people about B4. Yeah. I'll give Sheridan not noticing a pass because of what he was dealing with. But yeah, I can see that had word of the duel gotten to Garibaldi in time, I trust he would have tried to shut it down.
If I were to play devil's advocate on this, firearms and bladed weapons are policed very differently in the United States. Ownership of swords, I don't know if it's regulated at all. You can't go carrying them around in public, but you can have them. And so I feel like them owning swords would probably not be that, is conceivably not that big of a deal. Now, in an international diplomacy space station like Babylon 5, a variety of weapons are probably going to be a lot more consciously regulated. But I can at least conceive of a way in which it might not necessarily happen. All right. So that brings us to Scott McFadden's email about, knives. I'm always going to say it that way because Mantis. Hello again. Hi, Scott. Here is the second in my series of catch-up emails, this time about knives. This is another good episode, at least the Londo parts. As you noted, Sheridan's plotline is a bit less consequential in the grand scheme of things. As a longtime Trekkie, yes, I prefer Trekkie to Trekker, deal with it. I was thinking about that recently. I don't think that Trekker has really caught on very much at all. Like, I remember the big debate like a decade or two ago about Trekkie versus Trekker. I don't think people say Trekker much anymore.
I remember the debate in the 80s because it was really TNG fans separating themselves from TOS fans. It was the groups, whether they like the original or the Berman era. And I think it kind of faded as people came to accept both when TNG got better.
I took it as a Trekkie is your like dress up cosplay convention people, and Trekker is for the more serious, dignified fan. But I think just like the fact that fandom always involves cosplay and convention going is just a lot more accepted now widely than it was necessarily 20, 30 years ago. But I could be wrong. In any case, I don't know if I've heard Trekker used in the wild in years and years. Anyways, so Scott was saying, as a longtime Trekkie, I hate to use it's like Star Trek as a negative, but I know what's meant by that. Star Trek did often ignore the long-term ramifications of its events, especially during the TNG era, and Sheridan's story in this episode has that feeling. I would like to go on record as saying that I don't necessarily mean it as a negative when we're comparing and contrasting the two, just that it's a difference, and that the changes that Babylon 5 is making in storytelling are the kinds of changes that most TV storytelling would come to adopt. To use Star Trek to compare with itself, I think storytelling like Discovery, where you have a season-long narrative broken up into episodic chunks that always feed the overall narrative, there is something that is lost there compared to the this is the one with the gender identity issues, and Riker dates that one person from the planet who is stripped of their identity at the end of the episode. You know, where you have like a science fiction exploration of the human experience, and you remember that because that's that episode where that happened. And long form storytelling doesn't always have that same feel in its episodes, you know?
Yeah, when you lose episodic formats, you're telling fewer stories.
Mm-hmm.
Because, they all have to fit. So,
and certain chapters can be more memorable, but that's not the story. That's a chapter of a larger story.
Yeah, and I also don't generally saying this is like Star Trek would automatically make it an insult. I think saying it's like Star Trek is, like you're saying, it's a different style. It'd be like, it almost, getting a Star Trek feel in Babylon 5 would be like going to Subway and they're serving a burger. Right. There's sandwich shops and there's the burger joints, and it feels off to have the other menu showing up in the first restaurant.
Mm-hmm. Scott goes on to say, to Babylon 5's credit, it does manage to slip some bits of the larger storyline in, particularly Sheridan finding out about the mysterious return of Babylon 4. It seems like the kind of thing that the rest of the crew would have told him about at some point. On the other hand, since a whole lot of stuff has happened this year, starting on the very day he arrived, it makes sense that no one thought to tell him about one more weird thing that happened a while ago. The destruction of the Icarus would have been another such element if this episode had aired before In the Shadow of Zahadum as intended. I had gathered that Sheridan had read a lot of the station logs to help bring himself up to date. But when you have 2 years of probably multiple times a day log entries, you probably just start skimming after a while.
Mm-hmm. And I don't remember clearly how complete the logs of that would have been. And I'm trying to remember those events.
Well, it's not a part of the storytelling like Star Trek is, but yeah.
Yeah, was it classified or something?
Right. Oh, the Babylon 4 in particular? Yeah, I don't know. After his absence last episode, Londo returns with some important stuff. It starts to feel monotonous to say that Peter Jurczyk gives a great performance, but it remains true. His final scene is particularly effective, combining his grief at having killed his old friend, his admiration, if that's the right word, for Urza's strategy of allowing himself to be killed to spare his family, and his regret at the choices he has made and the path that he is on. It's so frustrating to watch Londo continue down this path, even as he understands what the cost is. It's so true to life. The difficulty of admitting that you've been wrong and doing something about it. All too often, it's easier to just keep going, even when, deep inside, you know it's a mistake. Yeah. I don't feel necessarily frustration with Londo, but I can see how that would be a thing. Sometimes I'm just, I don't know, aghast at him.
Yeah.
Veer has some good moments here, from his duet with Londo at the beginning to his warnings that longing for the glorious past of the Centauri is counterproductive. I keep wanting to say Centauri, but it's actually Centauri. It's Centaur, but whatever. This is, of course, Londo's whole problem. His nostalgia for the bygone days when the Centauri were a great power is what has brought about his entanglement with the shadows. Yeah. Wants to make Centauri great again, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Alas, Veer's warnings go unheeded. Yes, they do. Veer is such... My brain finished your sentence, Scott, before my eyes saw your words. And I was going to say this as Veer is such a good boy. He really is. I want to pet that broom. You're such a good boy, Veer. Keep doing what you're doing. Veer is such a good, steady presence in Londo's life, which I don't think that Londo appreciates enough. Even when he disagrees with what Londo is doing, he never abandons him or condemns him, but keeps hoping he can somehow bring Londo back to his senses. It's touching, but at the same time frustrating. Veer is one of my favorite characters in the series. I love following his development. Yeah, this is the man he works for. And I think there's a certain amount of when you serve somebody and you're by their side through so much of their daily actions. You see all sides of them. And whenever you notice them take a fork in the road that is unexpected, and they go down a path that is unexpected, and you're still working for them and still serving them, all you can do is do your best job and try to be a good influence. I think there's a lot like, when you have a really good friend who is now starting to make some bad choices in their life, there's only so much you can do. You can't really force them to stop making those choices. You can only try to be a good influence. And depending upon how good the friendship is, how much of a say you have in them,
Yep.
You don't want to leave them behind. That's not good friendship unless they become, toxic to you.
Yeah.
And I guess Londo does treat Veer badly, and that could be considered toxic, but it's Centauri society. He kind of expects it. And like I said, he's a servant. And, in his role as assistant, attaché, he's pretty much a servant.
Yeah, Londo's definitely more of a boss than a friend most of the time, and that's a big part of why Veer stays. This is his appointed job.
Right. All in all, an effective episode for the half of it that follows the Centauri plotline, and a well-executed, if less significant episode for the Sheridan-centered half. More to come, Scott.
There is. We have one more piece of feedback about knives. This is an email from John Georges. Thank you for keeping your pronunciation written there. And John actually sent another email, which he clearly marked as spoiling stuff that's coming down the road. So, John, we're going to sit on that email until it's no longer spoilers for first-time viewers and discuss it then. Because there's definitely stuff worth discussing in it. It's just not for right now. This email, John says, "Hi there. I wanted to commend you for your discussion of how this story could have played out better. Throughout the episode, I found Londo's decision-making hard to believe and out of character. The Londo we have seen to this point is self-centered and practical. Yes, he longs for the old glories of the Centauri Republic / Empire, but I felt it was out of character for him to be so devoted to tradition that he would accept a duel to the death. The duel that he knew he would lose. All the more so considering he is now the power behind the throne throughout his relationship with Morden and the Shadows. At the very least, Londo would have had to have some sort of arrangement for continuing the Centauri Shadows alliance that only he knows about after his near-certain death, if he even accepts the duel at all. All that is a long way of saying that I agree that if Londo had realized his friend was intending to use the duel to die honorably and protect his clan before the duel began, and had that conversation with Veer before the duel began, I think that would have not only made the storyline more believable, but would have made for a stronger episode as well. I'm looking forward to what you guys will be doing over the long break." All right, so we have...
Here we are, in the long break.
Yeah.
Doing our thing.
Yeah. All right, and we have 5 more pieces of feedback, 4 about Confessions and Lamentations, and 1 general catch-up from 5 different people. We also have a little under 20 minutes left. Yeah.
Well, actually 3. Only 3 of them have any length. So I think, you want to try to do it?
Yep, let's try. If you know what, I'm going to say that when this is released, it'll be 1 podcast. Let's wrap it up, and if that means we jump to another account to finish recording and edit them together, we'll do it that way.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, so our next piece is from FSM Dog, Confessions and Lamentations, says an episode that hits differently in the COVID world versus the world that thought of diseases as being history. Yeah, agreed. Watching this and knowing what quarantine is and having a very, first person relationship to the idea of being all in the same space is just going to spread the disease faster. What Franklin was saying was information to the viewer at the time. It was not news to us.
Yeah, I remember memes in 2021 saying, okay, now I know why the universe makes time travel impossible. If you time travel to the future, you die. If you go to the past, everybody dies.
Yeah. You take the other small one, take the next long one.
Simon Giles also comments on YouTube saying, the ritual meal has resonance with the rest of the episode as it mirrors elements of the Passover meal. The Jewish historian Henry Abramson jokes that all Jewish festivals boil down to, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. The dark angel of Drafa, echoing the angel that delivered the plagues to Egypt. One of my favorite moments in this episode is that slight pause from Garibaldi when he rescues a Marcab from getting beaten up, but then he hesitates to offer him a hand to help him up.
Yeah, I remember that. Like, there's sympathy, but then there's actual compassion, and those are two different things.
Yes.
The Dark Angel of Jaffa was part of the plague storyline. But then again, Passover is the meal taken after the plagues to commemorate being saved from them. So I can see how that theme actually links the two sides of the episode in a way that I hadn't really thought about before.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Simon. Mahatma Randy, Confessions and Lamentations, says that's a good point about the positive aspects of religion. I'm going to be honest. I don't think I picked that up on my own. I'm just used to Delenn doing that kind of thing, and Lanier is endlessly self-sacrificing. But yes, you are right. It does provide a benevolent counterpoint to be somewhat self-destructive religious panic of the Marcab. Also, I got to point out, Ferlin's performance at the end of this episode, she is absolutely wrecked by being in a room with several hundred or several thousand dying people. Her reaction when the little kid coughs is very moving, and her in a room of dead bodies coming out sobbing. I like the little twist that when she came out, she does call Sheridan John, but it's not out of intimacy or friendship. She's just so broken and horrified that all of the propriety has just been slapped out of her. I find it interesting that shot of her sobbing into Sheridan's chest is part of the opening credits later, but is used to commemorate a different kind of pain and mourning. So it's interesting what they'll do with editing sometimes. Also a little nice bit from Lanier, who's been through the exact same thing she has, but is obviously still more concerned with her than with himself. He's got this posture where he's obviously trying to catch her if she falls. Beautiful stuff. Beautiful, horrifying stuff. Well said, sir. Well said. It would be interesting to know how many people the religious aspect of Babylon 5 drove off. I am a religious fellow myself, so I was quite happy with it being included in the series, and I like that the series portrayed both the positive and negative aspects of organized religion. I mean, you and I are both non-religious people. I don't think we find religious themes in storytelling off-putting unless they're proselytory. That's me. Maybe I shouldn't speak for you, but I expect you probably feel similar.
Yeah, see, I have no issues with religion as it's used in Babylon 5, because again, we see both sides. The stuff I couldn't take, I mean, I knew Touched by an Angel was popular when I was in university. I gave it a shot, and that wasn't for me because it felt a little too, like you said, proselytary or preaching. It was like, this is the only correct path for anyone to choose. Whereas Babylon 5 is very much, these are the paths that are available, make your own choice. And as long as it's doing it that way, I don't have an issue with it.
Mm-hmm. It's like, it all depends on knowing what kind of party you're getting into. If I decide to sit down and watch The Chosen, I know I'm going to be watching dramatic development of the story of Jesus's life from the perspective of people who think this is based in reality and are trying to, bring out certain themes. And I'll go into that party knowing that's what I'm going into. And there's a certain part of me that is interested in that series. If I'm going into a story about, science fiction exploring the realities of human existence, religion being a part of that doesn't bother me at all, because I know that religion is a part of human existence, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we as people interact with spiritual concepts and religious concepts and how that affects politics and everything else. So yeah, I find it fascinating sometimes, depending upon, of course, how it's done. But
yeah, there's good ways to handle it and bad ways. Another one that rubbed me the wrong way. There are 2 surviving episodes of the Father Brown radio series And in the first one, a witness says he saw person A push person B out of a window. And person A confesses to the murder. And Father Brown goes through person B's apartment, makes an important discovery, brings everyone back in and says, I went through this whole apartment and I did not find a Bible. Person B did not know the love of God and must have been suicidally depressed because of that. I'm sure person A was trying to save him, but wanted to help his victim save face and was sacrificing himself to the trial rather than reveal this. And person A says, yes, that's exactly what happened. And then it's resolved. The witness said nothing. And I remember listening to that thinking, really? Really?
Wow.
Yeah.
So the thing is, that sort of thing actually probably has happened a number of times in, century or so ago, America and other places, but it is what it is.
Yeah. To be fair to the Father Brown short stories, that story was invented for the radio. It does not appear in the text.
Mahatma Randi goes on to say, I also like the relationships the individual characters had with religion. Ivanova being asked if she believes in God, and she says, I don't know, sometimes. And looking upward and saying, no offense, after her Ivanova is God speech. I find those eminently charming because I know that her faith is something that is important to her and yet also a source of, she wrestles with it,
Mm-hmm.
Sheridan's self-proclaimed a la carte religious beliefs, Garibaldi's amused atheism, Sinclair's Catholic childhood and non-committal kinda Unitarian present, which comes across as though he has wrestled with some things and hasn't quite resolved them all yet. The alien religions are interesting as well and pretty well detailed for this sort of thing. Religion had generally been kind of a taboo in science fiction. I don't think all of that was an atheist decision on the part of the creators of the shows. I think there was a strong feeling that it would be disrespectful to include real religions in these kinds of stories. And how often do you need to bring it up anyway? I mean, how many Westerns keep bringing up God? Not a lot. So it was easy to avoid. The only shows I can think of actually dealt with it prior to Babylon 5 was Battlestar Galactica, especially Mormonism in space, where the Mormons don't have an alcohol restriction, plus a lot of Eric Von Daniken thrown in for good measure. And the subject came up a few times on Space 1999, where the attitude was proudly agnostic. I don't know about God, John. I'm an astrophysicist and not a theologian. We've certainly seen some strange things since leaving Earth. That kind of thing. I'm just going to pause and say that I think a lot of storytelling treats religion more as a cultural element than as an element of dogma or actual belief. People will refer to God because it's part of their language. It's part of their just way of seeing reality. But that's not going to be like a focus of the storytelling unless that's a particular episode story you're doing.
Yeah, I think he's right when he says, how often do people bring it up anyway? I recently did a rewatch of all 11 seasons of Cheers. And for the most part, we have no idea which of those characters do and do not believe in God because it doesn't matter for the stories they are going through in the moment. So, right, the absence of those conversations doesn't seem out of place. So, yeah, I think he's right. It just, for some reason, science fiction is more likely to deal with it, partly because of that layer of abstraction.
I think there's also a certain amount of majority versus minority elements here. And, when you're going to treat religion for a character in something other than a non-specific Protestant view of Judeo-Christianity, it feels like you're making a choice, in a lot of the ways that at various points in time and still today to one extent or another, making a character something other than a white straight male feels like a choice. And so it's becomes the question of, well, what are you going to do with that choice and why are you making that choice? And I think having such a variety on Babylon 5 takes away from the feeling of we are choosing to make these characters be a certain thing. Instead, they just are. They just are that thing. And if it comes up in storytelling, it comes up, and most of the time it doesn't, which I think is pretty amazing for Babylon 5. Mahatma Randi goes on to say, also, they were extremely limited in what they were allowed to say on television in the 60s and 70s. There's an episode of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea where Admiral Nelson says, "I'll gladly make a deal with the devil if I thought it would save his life." But the network insisted on changing that to "with the stars," which makes no damn sense but whatsoever. Anyway, had a friend who was a fairly intolerant atheist, and although he was enjoying the show, the religious aspect of it, including the stuff about prophecies, finally just drove him off. I think that says more about your friend than it does about atheism, honestly. He could not make sense of it, and having it continually turn up was rather offensive to him. I don't know about you, Blaine, but for me, my atheism and my humanism go hand in hand. You know, I can't see it another way.
Yep. To me, when I'm reading about a fictional world, if that writer decides in this world the Judeo-Christian God is real, okay. Like, if it's trying to be an extension of our world, and I think Babylon 5 has treated it fairly, especially, when it comes to the prophecies, first-time viewers will be seeing them as prophecies. Those of us who've seen more of the show know where some of those prophecies came from. Hint, this series has established that time travel is possible. Mm-hmm. So,
I wonder how that friend felt about Babylon, about Deep Space Nine and the emissary and the Bajoran religious aspects, because that was a very core element of that show's development. But I know a few other people who were annoyed by the religious aspects of the show, but didn't stop watching because of that. But I'm sure my friend wasn't the only anti-theist to get pissed off and leave. I had another atheist friend who steadfastly refused to believe that JMS was not a Christian. Refused to believe that he was not okay. I explained he was not. My friend insisted JMS was obviously lying about that to further his Christian agenda. I'd be interested to know, but I have no idea how you'd go about figuring that out. What Christian agenda? In Babylon 5? Really?
Yeah. I don't know.
Where? I spent a lot of time in Christianity. I don't see any of that.
Yeah, so I'd say statistically, your friend here is probably not the only one, but I'm thinking he gets a small percentage. Looking at the clock, we have about 4 minutes and 12 seconds left to record. So apologies to those who are already listening on double speed. Scott McFadden writes, "Hi guys, I'm finally my email about Confessions and Lamentations. Now I'm all caught up. I confess that I haven't been looking forward to..." No, kidding. So we're going to stop this recording and start a new one. So you may hear a slight...
I don't think there's any need to narrate this we'll just splice it in.
Yeah, I'm just saying if there's a blip in sound quality, it's because we're about to close our current session and start a new one. All right, and Scott McFadden also emails about Confessions and Lamentations. He says, "Hi guys, and finally my email about Confessions and Lamentations. Now I'm all caught up. I confess that I hadn't been looking forward to this episode as much as some of the others. I had remembered it being a little more than an obvious metaphor for AIDS, which of course was prominently in the news at the time this episode was made. I'm sorry to say that, being fairly young and callow back in 1995, I was not as compassionate toward people infected with AIDS as I should have been, so I kind of thought this episode was what people today would call virtue signaling. Not my finest moment. Well, from that I will take away that you've grown as a person, so thank you for that, Scott. I think we've all been there about one issue or another.
Yeah. There are definitely things that are out there on podcast feeds that I find rather embarrassing now.
All right. So Scott continues. The episode is an AIDS metaphor, of course, but as your discussion shows, it's a great deal more than just that. It's really about all dangerous epidemics, of which AIDS at the time was merely the latest. Yeah, especially the epidemics where people are blaming some sort of morality or personal choice. It's really a form of victim shaming.
And isn't it weird how that so often seems to be the case the morality stuff with AIDS is like overly obvious. Like, okay, so like if AIDS had been a story, then blaming it so hard on a group you see as immoral would almost be an overly done thing, like on the nose. But even like with COVID, there was morality shaming, and there were people being, maybe less morality, but more like, you're a better person if you're not from a certain part of the world because that part of the world is diseasey kind of thing. It was just gross. It was gross thoughts and gross ideas coming out.
Well, yeah, like I have friends of Chinese descent who dealt with a lot of crap during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they were born and raised in Canada was irrelevant to the people giving them that crap. I've met people online who are going, well, do you think Spain was upset when they were calling it the Spanish flu in 1920? And to that I said, yeah, probably, considering it started in Kansas and was called the Spanish flu because it first spread among the Latino population who were living in densely populated, low-cost housing. That's why it became the Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with the country of Spain. And the fact that you still think it did 100 years later is why they had every right to be upset by it.
Yeah. And just a pedantic side note to sort of add to that. If it's Latino people in the U.S., that's not Spanish, that's Hispanic. But still, it's not their fault.
Yeah, it was called the Spanish flu because they were Spanish speakers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, but, we're also talking about an era where people would freak out if you used the wrong water fountain. So.
Right. Snowflakes, I tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Big white snowflakes.
Yep. Yes, the term coined by a very left-wing gay man to complain about toxic masculinity. And look who uses it now.
Yep.
Anyway, back to Scott's email. He continues, it's enlightening to watch this again, having lived through COVID and seen so many of the same mistakes, the same denial, the same lack of empathy, and the same determination too, as Dr. Lazarin says, choose whatever strategy makes the least sense and then do it. We really do repeat ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. This episode is also about compassion as exemplified by Delenn and Lanier going in to care for the Marcab at the potential risk of their own lives. It is a useful reminder that compassion and empathy consists not just of feelings, but of actions. You don't just pity the sick and the dying, you help them as best you can. In sharp contrast, we might add, to the various members of Franklin's medical staff who all visibly hesitate to go near the plague victims. As you mentioned, Blaine, it's remarkable to see religion portrayed so obviously as a force for good, a relative rarity in science fiction set in the future. That storyline also serves the additional purpose of showing the continuing development of Sheridan and Delenn's friendship. He's obviously worried about her safety in a way that he probably wouldn't be for any of the other ambassadors. I think that's fair. They're probably less sympathetic to Londo now. I think he'd be, of the other ambassadors, probably be most sympathetic to G'Kar, although not so much at this point because of G'Kar's history. Kosh, it wouldn't just be a lack of sympathy, but probably a lack of doubt that he'd even catch this disease, knowing so little about his biology.
Well, I think a lot of the compassion towards other ambassadors would also be less compassion from a humanity perspective and more concern from a ramifications perspective. What are the ramifications if G'Kar gets sick? What are the ramifications if Kosh dies? What's going to happen if Londo, perishes from this plague? And less of a, I care about this person and losing them kind of thing.
Scott continues, it's more of a personal concern than a professional one, culminating in the call me John line. And somewhat more subtle thing is that Sheridan tells her to call him John when we do see each other again. Not if we see each other, but we see each other. Despite the risk Delenn is taking, Sheridan shows his kind of faith in asserting that this is not their final pardon. Yeah, that is a nice touch. Dr. Franklin is, in his own way, just as determined and unwavering as Delenn. In his relentless drive to analyze and understand the disease above everything else, even his own health, his impatience with the superstition surrounding it, his equal impatience with his own staff for letting their fear get the better of them, he is the very image of the Doctor as hero. There is something a little pat in the way that, after a few sleepless nights and unswerving dedication, he at last makes the breakthrough, the discovery that lets them get the disease under control. A little bit, yeah. I mean, I get that the Marcab struggled with it and didn't really try. I'm assuming it's his xenobiological background. He just has a lot more familiarity with comparable diseases in other species than maybe more isolation as Marcab did.
And at the end of the day, this particular story is intended to be told within one episode, and so you have to resolve it somehow at the end. Now, granted, they could have gone with there's no cure and had the exact same ending otherwise. But I think it adds a certain amount of poignant irony that he finds a cure and goes to deliver it only to find no survivors.
Yeah. I think the only other way you could have a similar punch and not have him find that cure right at the end is to have someone like, maybe Sheridan comes into his office and he's excited he's got to break through. This one might finally turn it around. He wants to do it. And Sheridan's saying, no, go get some sleep. And no, seriously, go get some sleep. It's too late. They're all gone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Damn. Yeah. Although something occurred to me when I was watching this, they say that there are about 5,000 Markhab on the station. And they say that about 4,000 go into that containment. So I don't know if that was just a drop in the numbers, if there's a detail that I missed, or if the now nearly extinct Markhab includes 1,000 people who didn't catch the disease.
Yeah. I think the point was that all the Markhab are dead, so maybe the other 1,000 also had the disease and died. They just died outside of that controlled area.
Okay.
So, anyway, Scott continues again. As COVID also showed us, it doesn't work that way. But for a TV show, it's allowable, even if it is a bit of a cliche. What is not a cliche, of course, is the way that this discovery comes tragically too late, leaving us with the powerful scene of Delenn and Lanier standing alone among the bodies of the dead Markhab, barely able to speak about what they have seen. This is a wonderful example of the principle that what is not shown is far more effective than what is. We don't see the two Minbari watching helplessly as hundreds die all around them, but we can imagine it. Thanks for helping me to reconsider an episode that I hadn't thought much in quite some time. I'll see you on the other side of the hiatus, Scott.
Well, those kinds of sentiments are definitely the kinds that I think we enjoy the most, because it's like we actually had an impact in somebody's view of the show. That's neat to know.
Yeah. See, I know part of me is thinking, instead of having Sheridan come to Franklin at the end, another way to really have the gut punch is Franklin is working. He's excited about the possible revelation. He's talking about it with his staff, and he looks up, and Delenn is there. And he's just, oh, I thought you were going to stay till the end. Oh, I did.
Yeah. Similar concept, different way of showing it, yeah.
Yeah. Because just, it would be a lot less dialogue if he just sees Delenn and then starting to understand, but then trying to deny what he understands. And yeah. But anyway. Not that it would have been better than what we actually got, but a little bit different.
Yep. So our final piece of feedback, we squeeze it all into one episode, y'all. This is from Ian Ridley, a name that I feel like I might recognize, but also might not. I don't know. It's definitely not a name we've seen often if it's not new. He says, general catch up. Hi. Really enjoying your podcast. I have just about caught up with you after finding you earlier this year. Welcome to the show, Ian. You've inspired me to get the Blu-rays to watch along with you. Ha ha ha. Glad we got our cut of that. Wait, we don't get a cut.
No, but that's okay.
I saw Babylon 5 first time around in the UK in the early 90s, whilst I was at university, and rewatched it more times than I can remember. Back on Usenet in the 90s, a poll was set up to rate the episodes as they aired first time around. They are archived on the Lurker's Guide. It is a bit inexact, as there is no overview of standard or of the whole series for those voting for the early episodes. Okay, so you're giving the episodes ratings on a first time viewing, not having the entire series as context. Well, there's probably a certain amount of that kind of voting in the MDib votes as well. There are probably people who are watching for the first time voting as they go.
Probably, yeah. It is a similar concept. I even remember, probably more pronounced in the Lurker's Guide. So past guest Valen Alan Plexico, when he does his White Rocket Babylon 5 podcast with Andy, they pull those ratings and discuss them regularly. And the way they describe them, there was also a cutoff. So you could only vote for something like 1 or 2 weeks after it originally aired in the US. And after that, they would close the voting. So it's very much a first-time voter, whereas IMDb will have some element of people like myself who are rating it as we watched it on DVD, which again, first-time viewing, But, maybe others would be watching on DVD and going back and go, oh, I'm going to rate it again and see if I change my ratings. And now that you have the whole series for context, because the whole series here definitely adds context.
Right. So he goes on to say, nonetheless, it is interesting to see how viewers initially reacted to the series. Some of my votes are there, I think, for series 4 and 5. And he gives a link to the Lurker's Guide. Also, thank you for reminding me that Due South exists. I'm off to rewatch that soon. All the best, Ian Ridley, just outside, I'm going to say Leicester, England. Maybe it's Lister or Leicester.
I thought it was Leicester, yeah.
There's so many different ways to pronounce those last two syllables as they relate to the previous syllables that it's hard to know on a case-to-case basis. All right, so that wraps up our email episode, our feedback. So since we were able to get it all in one, what does that mean for our future?
All right. So that means we will need more feedback for our next feedback episode. So please send it. That also means that between now and the return of the show this fall, I just want to reconfirm that return date. Yeah. So the next broadcast episode we'll discuss is Divided Loyalties. That was season 2, episode 19, which first aired in the US on October 11th, 1995. So we do have a bit of a gap. In that gap, we can confirm that we will discuss comics issues 5 through 8, novel number 2, and comics issues 9 through 11. Those are locked because, yes, we have already recorded them. And one of those is already edited. Another one is an edit job in progress. So you could look forward to those. Like I said, I threw out the idea. I don't know if it'll work out with John's schedule. We may toss in coverage of Tron. I've been thinking about that anyway because it's got a lot of cast overlap. So if John's finally seeing it, maybe it's worth throwing that in there to help include more content in this break. And then when we come back, we will come back for 4 consecutive weeks, wrapping up season 2. Then there's only 5 days between the end of season 2 and the start of season 3, which will have a batch of 4 consecutive episodes in it as well. So we're going to have a batch of 8 episodes and then break from November 27th to January 29th.
Not too big of a break, just the holidays.
Yeah, that one is a lot more manageable. So again, we would appreciate feedback when we're doing that, which can be sent to Babylon5 30 years later at gmail.com. You can use, any combination of numerals or letters as long as they actually spell out 530 when you are setting those in, and we will catch that email.
You can also leave comments on the websites where the show is posted. Those are johnreadscomics.com, where my show is hosted, my podcasts live, and also Blaine's site.
Yep, that's bureau42.com. So all of my podcasts live there, as well as the podcasts of a couple of other people.
You can also leave reviews. We have not gotten any reviews yet that we have seen. No, we did get one. Did we get one? I feel like we got something. No, that was just my podcast. We haven't gotten reviews yet for the show. We have gotten 2 ratings, and the 2 people who have left ratings have left very nice ratings. Thank you very much. If you do leave a review, then when people search Babylon 5 podcasts, they can see your words and say whether or not they want to listen to these 2 random people talk about Babylon 5. So do please go and do that if you have a moment.
Yep. And you can also leave comments on our YouTube channel. So anything we post there, you can comment, and you do have the option to interact with others. And I did want to say, while we were covering that, I ran it through Forvo.com, and I think it's a Leicester, or Lister is how it's pronounced, at least with the British accent, which I think the fact that it's in the UK says the British accent should trump American or other accents.
So those are the 2 that I was sure about, Leicester and Lister.
Yeah. So I've been reading it as Leicester for most of my life, and I'm just wrong. All right, yeah. So that's what we have to look forward to. At least some comics and novels. And if the Tron episode happens, you will find out because it'll just be there in the feed. I don't think we're going to have a lot of preamble on that one.
I've just finished rereading novel 2 because that came out in May of 1995. So at this point in the 30 years ago calendar, novel 2 is out there. We're also in the middle of the 5 through 8 arc. I can't remember if we've read 6 or 7. I want to say we've read 7. I'm honestly not sure. I have to go back and look at the release dates. In any case, I'm reading those as we hit their calendar 30 years later release dates. And the Garibaldi Mars arc 5 through 8 I am sharing with Mindy as we go. So she lets me read her comics every now and then. And yeah, so looking forward to hearing our thoughts about those. It's been years since we recorded them.
Yep. We'll be releasing those about once a month. So comic issues 5 to 8 in July, novel 2 mid-August, and in comic issues 9 to 11 mid-September. And then so we're going to keep with that Saturday schedule until the end of season 2, and then shift to Thursdays for the start of season 3, and shift to Wednesdays halfway through season 3 as well.
Because leap years.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so do be looking forward to episodes. Stay subscribed. It'll be a little while, but they will be coming. And we will talk to y'all soon.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
And good eating to you.